Welcome to Insights and Indicators. I'm Jason Thomas, Carlyle's head of global research and investment strategy. And in this podcast, I share our observations and opinions on the economic landscape, as well as insights from research being conducted by our team here at Carlyle. Today, I have the great honor of being joined by my partner here at Carlyle, Admiral James Stavridis, our Vice Chair of Global Affairs and Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation. A former four-star U.S. Navy Admiral and Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, he regularly provides commentary to national media outlets on the geopolitical arena and national security issues. Thank you again, Admiral, for joining me today.
Well, wonderful to be with, as we would say in the Navy, a very fine shipmate. Always a pleasure, Jason. What shall we talk about?
Well, I do have a bit more to go through, so I apologize for that. First, just bookkeeping purposes, this episode was recorded on October 15th, 2024, and the discussion reflects composite portfolio data and analysis of recent government reports that are accurate as of that date. And so, Admiral, before turning to you with some questions about what we're seeing in the world, I'm just going to spend a minute or two talking about what we've seen in the economic environment since our last podcast. And first, I want to talk about official data released in October for the month of September, because they both went in the same direction, the two major reports. First, you had an employment report that far exceeded expectations and really was probably quite shocking to those analysts who had been predicting that the US economy was falling into recession. So not only did you have very strong payroll growth, over 100,000 above so-called consensus expectations, but also a fall in the unemployment rate and a fall in the number of job seekers relative to open but unfilled positions. And as a result, you had an increase in wage gains. Wage growth on an annual basis was 4%, which matched a 5-month high. At the same time, later this month, we saw that the inflation data were somewhat hotter than expected. If you look at the core and you were to strip out shelter, which generally is lagging, has not matched the current trends in new rents, you had an inflation rate of almost 5% annualized in the month of September. Certainly no one should overreact to a single month of data, but also it just paints a picture of inflation perhaps not coming down to that 2% target as fast as many people anticipated. Inflation continues to be what's implied from this, from the core PCE that the Fed targets, is inflation that continues to be much closer to 3% than it is 2% on an annual basis. I would say, from our view of the portfolio and our own portfolio data, I do think this is a classic case where a relatively small share of GDP, maybe about 4%, is growing so rapidly that it's adding about 1 percentage point to growth, even if many other parts of the economy are either struggling with high rates, as is the case with real estate, fixed residential investment. And really, this, of course, is the boom that we see, this generational boom in fixed industrial investment. So it's the investment in data centers and associated hardware applications, and then the physical infrastructure associated with those data centers. It's continued growth in green industry, of course, most notably battery technology, manufacturing plants, and then, of course, the renewable energy and what's being added to the grid. And so our data suggested that if you look at this area of the economy, there was a 23% growth over the 12 months in September. So again, that this has been something we've talked about many months, but the growth rates really here remain as impressive as ever. And I think investment intentions for the next 12 to 18 months remain very, very strong. So, to me, could the economy fall into recession next year? Of course. And in fact, Admiral, I'm glad you're here, because I think some of the issues that we'll touch on could provide some of the shocks that actually cause that to happen. But in general, when you have tailwinds like this, and of course, part of that is a very large fiscal deficit and the contribution that makes to current period incomes and growth, this is not an economy that's going to fall in recession because of a run-of-the-mill shock or something of a small magnitude. The consumer sort of turning over or a slowdown in spending. This actually is an economy, I think, that's strong enough that tipping over in a recession would require a fairly sizable shock. And so, again, anything's possible. But I think the data, both from official sources and our own portfolio, do suggest that there's a bit more staying power here, both with respect to real output and perhaps price pressures than many people thought 6-7 weeks ago. And as a result, you have seen some backup in yields. When you look at the 2 to 10 year, you now have, from the time of the Fed rate cut, which was September 16th, about a 40 to 50 basis point increase. It's become more complicated, I would say, in some sense, even as the outlook for incomes, employment, et cetera, has somewhat brightened. So with that, again, thank you for joining us, Admiral. I do want to start with the Middle East. Obviously, there was this ballistic missile attack launched by the Islamic Republic of Iran on Israel. It seems you would know better than me, but media reports suggest there were no Israeli casualties, but it did do some, what you could say is non-trivial damage. And there are expectations that there will be an Israeli response. I also wanted to make note of the US. The news reports suggest that there has been a THAAD system, which is Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, missile defense system. I think about 100 US service members will be accompanying it. So first, what are your expectations for an Israeli response? And secondly, if you could discuss the significance of that military hardware that is being sent to Israel.
I'd be glad to. Let's start with the Israeli response. Here, I take the Minister of Defense of Israel, Yoav Gallant, at his word. He has described the response as lethal, precise, and surprising. So you kind of have to thread through that as a military analyst. To me, that sounds like some portion of it will be cyber related, probably going after military command and control. A portion of it will certainly be kinetic. Here, I don't expect a strike on the Iranian nascent nuclear facilities, nor do I expect a strike on the energy capacity of Iran. Both of those are harder targets in a certain sense and less certain outcomes. So the Goldilocks attack would probably include a cyber strike associated with kinetic action against an Iranian military industrial target set. If I were to guess, and thinking about proportionality and responding under international law, I think the Israelis may very well go after the assembly, manufacture, repair facilities for ballistic missiles. Given that the Iranians shot 200 of them, they're a pretty hard target to knock down. We'll come on to that in just 1 second. But the Israelis would love to denude the Iranians of the capacity for further ballistic missile production and strikes. And I'll close on that aspect of things by pointing out, unfortunately, Iran has about 2,000 capable ballistic missiles. They launched about 200. So they still have a lot in the locker. I think Israel would love to reduce that threat. More quickly, I can give you a snapshot of this THAAD system, highly capable, cutting-edge air defense, comparable to the air defense systems that the U.S. Navy has on its Aegis combatants, its cruisers and destroyers, which is to say it can intercept ballistic missiles moving 5, 6, 7, 8 times the speed of sound at very high altitudes, dozens of miles up above the earth. Very hard target to hit, but the THAAD has an excellent track record of doing so. And final thought, THAAD is only one of a family of air defense systems. Everyone knows about Iron Dome. Iron Dome will not shoot down a ballistic missile. THAAD will. Aegis at sea on an American destroyer will do so. Israelis have also David Sling and Arrow, kind of similar systems. The point here is it's a team sport. All of those systems will have to be online to protect the state of Israel. I'm confident they can do that, Jason.
The deployment would seem to imply expectations that Iran would respond to this retaliation in kind. I'm wondering how worried we should be about a tit for tat escalation here.
We ought to be concerned about it, but there are still several levels to go in that vertical ladder of escalation before we come to a full-on regional war involving all elements of combat power between Iran and Israel. What we ought to be concerned about in the context of a wider war, if this continues again and again and again and again, and we end up in that wider war, the real concern is what would Iran do in terms of potentially closing the Strait of Hormuz? As you know well, Jason, 25 to 30% of the world's oil flows through that strait. And also, Iran might be tempted to strike Saudi oil production facilities. The idea being by closing the strait, striking the Saudis, they would give the global economy exactly the kind of geopolitical shock you're talking about. The theory in Tehran would be by doing that, they could convince the international community to put pressure on Israel to step down in its combat operations. That's a long way from where we are today, but let's hope that vertical ladder of escalation kind of peters out before we get to that wider regional war.
I want to turn to Ukraine. Last month, of course, the United Nations General Assembly, President Zelensky was in the United States. He came to Washington. There was talk of a victory plan. There was a summit that I believe was scheduled to be held in Ramstein, the US base there, that was postponed. Yeah. Again, it seemed to be a prelude to negotiations, maybe international pressure to get to the negotiating table. Where do we stand in that conflict?
Where we stand today is everybody's hitting pause for about 22 days until the US election occurs. And the reason for that is many observers on both sides of the Atlantic, and certainly observers in Kyiv and Moscow, believe that there will be a dramatic difference between Team Trump and Team Harris. And therefore, don't look for any substantive movement either on the battlefield, frankly, or toward a negotiation until after the election. So let's hypothesize on both sides of this equation. As always, at Carlyle, we're bipartisan, nonpartisan, I should say. If Team Trump comes in, they have pretty clearly indicated an intent to put immediate extreme pressure on Kyiv to negotiate, probably for them, the Ukrainians, to effectively give up Crimea and the provinces that connect Crimea to Russia, about 20% of Ukraine. Team Harris, on the other hand, has publicly maintained a stance that we will continue to support fully the war effort. All of those decisions about negotiations, those are decisions for Ukrainians to make, not Americans, not Europeans. So there is an optical difference between the two positions. However, I think that under either Team Trump or Team Harris, there will be pressure on the Ukrainians to get to a negotiation. There's already pressure on Putin to get to a negotiation because he is experiencing such profound military losses, particularly of personnel on the battlefield. So as I roll all that together, I think the differences between Team Trump and Team Harris may be more stylistic. You'll see immediate, loud, aggressive pressure from Team Trump. From Team Harris, probably more sort of off stage, a little more quietly, more, don't you think, my friends in Kyiv, that it's time for a negotiation? But in either instance, I think we're probably headed toward negotiations in 2025. Let's hope so.
One follow-up to that, of course, between the election, which, as you mentioned, 3 weeks from today, and the inauguration of the president on January 20th, and of course, the formal seating of the new Congress earlier that month, there is a lame duck session. And I wonder, there's talk here in Washington about a supplemental, some additional support for the war effort in Ukraine. There's clearly majorities in both houses for additional support. I'm wondering, are you hearing that? Or to what extent could the outcome of the election perhaps shape the size or the form that that package takes?
I think you are exactly right that, again, no big decisions are going to be taken till after the election. And certainly if there is, let's say hypothetically, a Republican sweep and Trump comes into the White House and the Republicans hold both houses, I think the chances for that supplemental decrease fairly significantly. If, on the other hand, there's a Harris win or a split government, I think there is a chance that a Biden administration on the way out the door would try to get a supplemental across, thus relieving the incoming Harris administration having to expend the political capital to do that. So I think that's a question that will be determined by the outcome on November 5th.
I want to just turn to China. And just before I do want to emphasize one of the macro topics of great interest is, of course, the stimulus in China. And to me, this is really very simple. You have, over the course of this year, Chinese industrial production running at about 4.5% or so, according to our data. At the same time, domestic consumption has been running at a rate less than 2%. This means that, only about a third of that industrial production can be absorbed domestically. It means it has to be exported. Of course, that creates pressure on export partners who perhaps could complain about excess capacity in China or, too many goods entering their market. So Chinese leadership had a decision to make: either scale back growth or allow for more of this production to be absorbed domestically. And that is, of course, means stabilizing the property market, which accounts for about 70% of Chinese households' net worth, and also doing more to foster consumption. But in your world, I think what has been most interesting and concerning over the past few weeks has been the dispute between China and the Philippines.
Correct.
The report of a Chinese ship that hit a fisheries vessel. And also there is reports about US-Filipino war games that could be taking place in a response to some of the bellicosity, you could say, that has been witnessed recently by the Philippines from China. Where do we stand there, and how concerned should we be?
Let me start by kind of getting everybody on the same sheet of music here. There's a vast body of water called the South China Sea. It's half the size of the United States of America. China claims it in its entirety as territorial waters, meaning complete sovereign control. They get to use all the oil, all the gas, all the fisheries. They control any shipping that goes through it. The rest of the world believes that the South China Sea are international waters, high seas, and that beyond the 12-mile territorial sea of China, China does not exert territoriality. Here we come to the Philippines. Over on the eastern side of the South China Sea sit the Philippine Islands. I love the word bellicosity between China and the Philippines. At the moment, Jason, the good news is that it's been thus far limited to their coast guards. These are effectively law enforcement vessels. Thus far, it has not elevated to the level of two navies going at it. Let's hope it stays at that point, because this may or may not come as a surprise to many listeners to the podcast, but the Philippines are treaty allies of the United States. We have a mutual defense treaty, just like we do with NATO. So an attack on the Philippines, a military attack, would be regarded as an act of war against the Philippines, and the U.S. is committed by treaty to come to the defense of the Philippines. So that's, as you say, quite concerning. And there's two views to conclude here, back to China and what's happening with their economy. One view would be, in the end, this is not the time that Xi Jinping is looking for a significant conflict in the South China Sea, or for that matter, an invasion of Taiwan. I hold that view. There are others who have the view that Xi Jinping might want to create a distraction in the world of geopolitics to take attention away from the unemployment in China, all the economic challenges you mentioned. That's another arguably distinct and plausible theory of what's happening here. I, for one, remain cautiously optimistic that posturing between China and the Philippines stay kind of at the Coast Guard level, that China will conduct some war games around Taiwan. They've done that recently, but in neither case is Xi Jinping looking to sort of bend the global economy with an all-out kind of campaign against either the Philippines or Taiwan. Let's hope it stays that way, Jason.
Finally, this fall, Carlyle is launching a new series entitled Navigating Leadership. I was hoping you could tell us a little about that.
Well, thank you. This relates to something I do and enjoy deeply at the firm, which is do a variety of seminars and talks and engagement, not about geopolitics and not about macroeconomics, but about leadership. And it distills what I learned in almost 4 decades as a senior leader in the military and then in higher education as the dean of a law school. So I try to take what I learned along that voyage and working with my partners, really at many levels in the firm, talk about navigating the shoals of leadership. So the idea of the new series is to put some of that into documentation, to video some of these lessons, to talk about it, to tell some stories, and to share it more broadly with our LPs, all of the folks with whom we're so proud to partner at Carlyle. So thanks about asking about it. We're going to start filming over the next few days, as a matter of fact, and very soon that content will be coming out across all of our Carlyle platforms. Navigation, a great word.
We look forward to seeing it. Thank you so much. And Admiral, thank you so much for joining me this month. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
On behalf of the team here at Carlyle, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for the next episode of Insights and Indicators.